All right, let's talk about the Eldar, not the somber survivors you see now among the craft worlds, not the desperate raiders of Kamara, and certainly not the psychic ghosts drifting through infinity. No, I mean the Eldar, when they were still gods in the making, when their empire stretched across the stars like a tapestry of perfection, and every world they touched bloomed in song and silence. Before there were wars for survival, before the galaxy turned its back on their light, there was only the elegance of control and the unbearable arrogance of thinking they had mastered it all. But even gods fall, and when the Eldar fell, they didn't just stumble into ruin. They birthed a god of death and desire that tore reality open like flesh. That moment, the fall, wasn't just a catastrophe. It was a scream that echoed across the warp, heard by every soul, every creature, every realm. It was the instant the galaxy changed forever. And yet, there were those who saw it coming. Not many, fewer than few. But some of them tried to run, not from fear, but from the certainty of knowing what awaited. They weren't just passengers. They were mourners at the funeral of a species that hadn't died yet. The pale ships, ghostly, ancient vessels that drifted into obscurity long before the galaxy realized the Eldar were already bleeding out. We don't talk about them enough. Maybe because they're wrapped in too much sorrow, too many half-truths. Maybe because they ask questions we don't want answers to. Who were their captains? What did they see? And most of all, why did they leave when everyone else danced closer to oblivion? To understand the pale ships, we have to go back, farther than the myths, deeper than the archives, into the beating heart of a civilization that knew perfection and traded it for damnation. Before the fall, the Eldar weren't just a powerful civilization, they were the civilization. It's difficult to describe just how utterly dominant they were without slipping into mythological language, but it's not myth. It's history. It's fact. For millions of years, they were the undisputed masters of the galaxy, shaping it to their will not through crude machines or brute force, but through a synthesis of art, emotion, and psychic resonance. Imagine a race so advanced that technology wasn't even visible anymore. It simply existed around them, integrated into the world like breath, like instinct. They didn't build with screws and steel. They sang worlds into shape. That's not poetic exaggeration. That's what they did. Planets bloomed under their touch, cities soared without foundations, and reality itself bent slightly to accommodate their elegance. Their minds, those minds, were terrifying in their clarity and complexity. Every Eldar was a psychic, not in the wild, unpredictable way humanity fumbles with psychic power, but in a way that felt natural, inevitable. The warp whispered to them gently, and they listened like it was an old friend. They could manipulate it, not with rituals or runes, but with sheer will and refined discipline. And as their intellects grew sharper, so too did their souls deepen. They weren't just powerful, they were exquisitely aware of their own beauty. And that might have been their first mistake. Eldar society wasn't monolithic. It was layered, interwoven, an intricate lattice of castes, functions, and philosophical traditions. Some say they had no need for laws because every Eldar simply knew their place and embraced it. Others argue that their perfection came at the cost of stagnation, that they stopped evolving precisely because they thought they had already achieved everything. But there's no denying the awe their civilization inspires. Their governance wasn't centralized like the Imperium's clumsy bureaucracy, nor was it anarchic. It flowed like a river, thought, emotion, function, destiny, all connected. Their gods, too, were alive in a way that defies comparison. Isha the mother, Cain the warrior, Val the smith, Morai Heg, the weaver of fates. They weren't just symbolic figures. The Eldar felt them, touched them in dreams and meditations. Worship wasn't a matter of faith, it was communion. The line between mortal and divine was thin, and sometimes it seemed like it didn't even exist. That was the gift and the curse of the Eldar. They lived in a galaxy where reality and thought intertwined so tightly that one could give birth to the other. That's power beyond imagining. That's also a recipe for disaster. Some fans compare this era to humanity's mythical golden age of technology, but that's honestly an understatement. The Eldar didn't just colonize worlds, they harmonized with them. Their webway gates allowed instantaneous travel across vast distances, bypassing the warp entirely. They weren't just avoiding danger, they were outgrowing it. They built craft worlds the size of continents and laughed at the crude void ships of other races. They cured diseases not with medicine, but with song and psychic alignment. Death itself was less a tragedy and more a transition, part of the Great Flow. Souls didn't vanish. They were preserved, guided, returned. And yet, for all this mastery, something began to change. Slowly, subtly. The more they refined themselves, the more detached they became. From nature, from struggle, from consequences. There's a fan theory I've always found haunting, that the Eldar stopped being alive in the way we understand it, that their civilization became a kind of living mausoleum, perfect but cold, serene but hollow. They were gods without anything left to create, so they turned inward. And inward is where the rot always starts. But make no mistake, the pre-fall Eldar were glorious, utterly, terrifyingly glorious. Their fall is only so tragic because of how high they stood. It's like watching a star collapse, not just a body dying, but a light devouring itself from within. And it's important to remember this grandeur when we talk about the pale ships, because the ones who boarded them, they knew. They remembered what the Eldar had once been, and that made the grief of what was coming all the more unbearable. And then came the rot. No great empire ever falls in a single day. No species collapses without warning. There's always a soft moment before the fracture, an indulgence, a small cruelty ignored, a voice silenced, a hunger left to grow unchecked. For the Eldar, that moment lasted millennia. It didn't come with war or invasion. It came with whispers, with sighs in the dark, with pleasure raised to a sacrament and pain twisted into an art form. It's one of the most horrifying things to grasp about their downfall. It wasn't something done to them. They did it to themselves, eyes wide open, hearts dulled. You have to understand, their civilization had already conquered every material challenge. There were no diseases, no famines, no external threats worth fearing. In their arrogance, they believed they had tamed both the galaxy and their own natures. But a species that feels everything, with the intensity of the Eldar cannot remain idle. Their passions, once the source of beauty and growth, began to mutate. The line between sensation and purpose blurred. When nothing is forbidden, nothing is sacred. And that's exactly what began to happen. First came the little things. Isolated acts of indulgence dressed up as artistic expression. New sensory experiences pushed to their limits. Psychic stimulations, emotional entanglements, empathic drugs that let one Eldar feel the deaths of 1,000 species simultaneously. It started as performance, as ritual, even as protest against the perceived sterility of perfection. But that was just the surface. Beneath it all, something deep had started to stir. A hunger not born from necessity, but from the aching void of having too much and feeling too little. It's that terrifying paradox. When you can have anything, nothing satisfies. The pleasure cults were the first true symptom of what would come to be known as the Fall. These weren't hidden, shameful sects. They were open, lavish, seductive. Entire city ships became mobile orgy worlds. Halls filled with music that could kill, paintings that caused madness, psychic feedback loops where pain and ecstasy were indistinguishable. You have to remember the Eldar didn't do anything halfway. When they pursued beauty, they created wonders. When they pursued violence, they became avatars of war. So when they pursued excess, it was apocalyptic. Some fans argue that these cults began as philosophical movements, attempts to break free of stagnation, to feel again in a culture numbed by its own glory. And maybe that's true. Maybe some of them did believe they were reaching for a higher plane. But whether by design or consequence, what they actually achieved was depravity without end. And the worst part? It became fashionable. The more twisted your tastes, the more revered you were. Social prestige came not from wisdom or leadership, but from how deeply you could immerse yourself in sensation and still come out alive. Until even that wasn't enough. There's a particularly haunting tale whispered by Eldar outcasts, a story about a ship that hosted a celebration so decadent, so cosmically obscene, that it echoed in the warp and gave it form. Not metaphorically, literally. The cries of those aboard, their psychic reverberations of boundless pleasure and cruelty, fed a growing presence in the immaterium that had no name yet. That would come later. But the seed was planted. Slaanesh wasn't born in a single instant. She gestated in the soul of a species that forgot how to love anything except itself. By this point, even the noblest houses had splintered. Traditionalists were called cowards. Resistors were mocked or hunted. Dissent was drowned in ritual and excess. The webway, once a network of unity and exploration, became a playground for horrors that no longer needed to hide. Those who still held to the old ways either went into seclusion or worse, pretended to participate, hoping to delay the inevitable. And that's where some of the first whispers about the pale ships began to emerge, from the margins, from those who saw the future shaping in the blood-streaked mirrors of their people's decadence. It's important to realize, the fall didn't come from some dark outside force crashing through their walls. It came from the music they played, the dances they danced, the mirrors they kissed. It came from the way they turned every sacred thing into spectacle. That's the true horror of the Eldar's decline. Not just that they lost everything, but that they invited their own annihilation, dressed in gold and scented with perfume. It didn't begin with explosions. There were no alarms, no flaming cities or rifts in the sky. Not at first. The beginning of the end came in whispers, in sleepless nights and the taste of blood in the soul. The first to notice were the psychers, the true ones, the quiet ones, the ones who listened more than they spoke. Far from the excess and laughter of the pleasure cults, they sat still in the shadows of the webway, and something started to scream. Not in words, not even in thoughts, just pure aching wrongness, like a note played so off-key that reality flinched. There are fragmented records, echoes preserved in spirit stones and half-forgotten mind runes that speak of the dream plague, a phenomenon that swept through the Eldar core worlds. People would fall asleep and wake sobbing, or not wake at all. Some whispered of endless falling, of being chased through tunnels that bled, of faces without eyes staring back from behind a veil of silk. These weren't just bad dreams. They were shared, spreading like a psychic infection. Entire populations began to experience the same terrors. Eldar, who had never met, would describe identical visions in agonizing detail. A black sun, a cradle of bone, a mother that eats her children while singing them lullabies. Over and over those images came, burned into their minds like sigils carved into flesh. And then came the waves, like pulses through the warp, not from without, but from within their own empire. Psychic echoes of violence, of despair, of uncontrollable hunger. They rippled through the webway like seismic tremors beneath a calm sea. Portals flickered unpredictably. Entire passageways in the labyrinth dimension would simply vanish or become labyrinths of pain and madness. Some ships traveling the webway never emerged again, while others came back warped, not physically, but spiritually. Their crews aged centuries in days, or forgot their own names. Or worse, remembered things that had never happened. One infamous incident tells of a wayfarer vessel that arrived at a craft world screaming nonsense about the mirror that devoured the mother and then melted into a pool of sound and color. No survivors, no explanation. There were warnings, far more than people like to admit. Seers from the outer craft worlds began to send increasingly frantic messages to the core. They spoke of prophecies unraveling, of skeins of fate tangling and snapping like overstretched thread. The future itself, once visible in graceful arcs and luminous possibilities, became a roiling storm of contradiction and grief. No vision ended well. No path led to peace. A few tried to rally resistance, to call for restraint, to halt the worst excesses. Most were mocked, others simply disappeared. There's an old saying among the Bieltan exiles: the first to see the fire is always called mad by those warming their hands. And so it was with the prophets of the fall. Even the gods grew quiet. That might be the most chilling sign of all. The psychic resonance that had once connected the Eldar to their pantheon started to dim. Fewer heard the voice of Isha. Kaini's presence felt muted, like he was retreating, hiding his fury behind the veil. Some even claimed they saw him weeping in their dreams, not for himself, but for his children, for what they were becoming, or maybe for what he was powerless to stop. Among scholars, those few who still dare dig through pre-fall memories, there's one theory I find impossible to shake: that the Eldar soul, as a collective force, knew what was coming. Not consciously, not in any way that allowed them to prepare or fight back, but at a deeper instinctual level, like animals before an earthquake. Their dreams became reflections of that terror. Their psychers became lightning rods for a storm that hadn't even formed yet. And the webway, that ancient artery of their power, began to reject them like a body rejecting a poisoned organ. Not violently, not yet, just silently. A few, just a few, listened. They weren't the most powerful or the most renowned. Some weren't even trusted. But they saw the signs. And more importantly, they believed them. They whispered to each other in half-forgotten dialects, shared dreams, collected the signs, drew maps of places where the veil thinned and something pressed against the edge, begging to be born. And in those moments, in those hidden circles, the first ideas of escape began to take shape. The pale ships weren't named yet. They didn't even exist. But the people who would eventually board them had already started to pull away from the warmth of the fire, because they could smell the smoke. They weren't called the Pale Ships in the beginning. That name came much later, whispered like a curse or a prayer, depending on who remembered them. Back then, they were just prototypes. Strange, silent vessels that didn't belong to any known craft world or noble lineage. They appeared quietly, almost deliberately unnoticed, like someone was building them in the shadows on purpose. And maybe that's exactly what was happening. Because the truth is, we still don't know who truly made them. No surviving Eldar lineage claims ownership. No record exists in the data cryptexes of Ulthwé or the singing scrolls of Alatok. It's as if they were willed into being by a collective fear that had no voice. The ships were unlike anything the Eldar had created before. And remember, that's saying something. Eldar craft are already living, resonant structures shaped by psychic effort and aesthetic will. But these vessels were different, colder, sleeker, built not for beauty or battle, but for escape, not even for exploration, really. There was something haunting about their design, like they had no interest in returning once they left. Some say they didn't even have proper names, just sigils carved into their hulls with psychic tools that hurt to look at. Others describe them as colorless, not white, but the absence of hue, like the light had forgotten how to touch them. There's a theory I really like, though it's more myth than history. It says the Pale Ships were created by a secret cabal of Farseers who had walked too far into the skeins of fate and come back half-mad. These weren't the calm, dignified seers we imagine in craft-world towers. These were visionaries whose eyes bled when they looked into the future, who spoke in riddles and built with trembling hands. They gathered in silence, far from the core worlds, and began constructing the ships from materials no one could trace. The soul bones of lost moons, the forgotten songs of exiled gods, components that seemed more like memories than matter. The ships weren't born. They were shed, like skin from a dying hope. Another version of the story says that the ships were commissioned by a high-ranking artisan cult, one that had refused to fall into the excesses of the pleasure houses. These artisans had seen their peers lose themselves in madness and indulgence, and instead of following, they turned inward. They started crafting a different kind of masterpiece, not something to be admired, but something to endure. A vessel that could cut ties with what the Eldar had become. They called it a psychic ark, something that could carry not just bodies, but fragments of what the Eldar used to be. Not just passengers, but refugees of the soul. Whatever the truth, what matters is that the ships were real, and that someone, whether a council of prophets, a nameless god, or a community of scared artisans, decided that running wasn't cowardice. It was clarity. These ships weren't numerous, maybe a dozen, maybe fewer. They weren't war-ready. They didn't bristle with weapons. Some even lacked conventional engines. They moved through the webway like dreams, slipping through cracks, leaving no trace, their paths forgotten as soon as they passed. What's strange is how quiet their departure was. You'd expect panic or crowds begging to come aboard, but the opposite happened. The pale ships weren't announced. They simply left, one by one. Some from hidden void yards in the fringe of the webway. Others from dry dock stations no one had used in centuries. They gathered no fanfare. They didn't even leave warnings. Just silence. Almost as if the act of leaving was an apology too deep for words. And the passengers? We'll talk more about them soon, but for now, it's important to say this. They weren't the heroes. They weren't the famous names we carve into our minds when we think of Eldar legends. Most of them were nobodies. Outcasts, seers with cracked spirit stones, artists who couldn't look at their own work anymore, soldiers who had dropped their blades and walked into the void without looking back. They weren't running because they were afraid of death. They were running because they knew death was already inside their people, whispering lullabies to a god that hadn't been born yet. There's a reason they're called the Pale Ships, not just because of their color, but because of the feeling they leave behind. An ache, a presence you only notice once it's gone. They weren't built to carry hope. They were built to carry memory, a memory of what the Eldar were before they forgot themselves. And maybe, just maybe, a chance to keep that memory alive in a galaxy that was already beginning to forget. You have to imagine the silence, not the loud kind that follows an argument or the eerie quiet of a dead world. I mean the heavy, intimate silence that lives between choices. That breath before you step off a ledge and trust something will catch you. That's what it must have felt like, boarding a pale ship, because no one knew where they were going. Not really. These weren't migration fleets. There were no maps, no colonies waiting at the edge of the stars, no promises. Only a whisper, leave now or burn with the rest. And yet, some did. Not many. Maybe a few hundred souls total across all the ships. The records don't agree. Some say a single ship carried fewer than 20. Others believe that a few ships were vast inside, like dimensional pockets, large enough to hold entire forgotten temples. But even if that's true, we're still talking about a drop in the ocean, a fragment of a species choosing exile over oblivion. And the ones who boarded, they weren't the ones anyone expected. They weren't heroes. That's one of the first things you have to accept. No famous exarchs or high farseers, no legendary warriors or matriarchs of noble houses. In fact, a good number of them were considered broken. Failed artists, excommunicated seers, soldiers who had laid down their arms out of disillusionment, not cowardice. People who had seen too much or felt too much or stopped feeling entirely. There's a sadness to that, sure, but also something powerful, because those are the ones who truly saw the fall coming. One of the most persistent fan theories is that at least one of the Pale Ships was guided by a seer who had deliberately severed their connection to the Infinity Circuit. Think about that. Cutting yourself off from your ancestors, from the soul collective of your people, to protect yourself from the scream that was beginning to build in the warp. That takes more than insight. It takes grief so deep, it becomes strategy. These weren't opportunists trying to escape. They were mourners building their own tomb in the stars. Some were pushed to leave not by visions, but by things they couldn't unsee in real life. There are whispered accounts of entire noble estates where guests were flayed alive as entertainment, their pain fed into psychic amplifiers to heighten the ecstasy of the audience. Artists who once sculpted joy were now commissioned to create agony. Philosophers who spoke against it were offered the choice, silence or dismemberment. It wasn't just decadence. It was institutionalized madness. So those who could still feel revulsion, they left. Because if they didn't, they feared they'd either become like the rest or lose what little of themselves remained. Others, well, some just wanted their children to live. That part never gets mentioned enough, but it breaks me every time I think about it. There are stories always unconfirmed of mothers and fathers, psychic healers, gardeners, lore keepers, who took their young and fled into the pale ships because they couldn't bear the idea of their offspring becoming what they saw in the pleasure cults. Some of those children never knew what they were running from. They just held hands in the dim white corridors and looked out into the cold, unknowable dark. And then there were the quiet ones, the ones who never said anything, who didn't cry out against the fall, didn't condemn the revelers, didn't speak of the future. They just walked away. You'll find a lot of reverence for them in the few oral traditions that survive, those anonymous figures, their names long erased, who simply looked into the abyss and chose to leave. I think there's a dignity in that, a rare kind of strength, not dramatic, not heroic, just silent resistance. Of course, there are debates. Some say the ones who left were selfish, that they abandoned their people instead of staying to fight or heal or warn, that their flight was a betrayal, not salvation. But I don't buy that, because what was there to save, really? By the time the Pale ships launched, the soul of the Eldar civilization was already unraveling. No one was listening to warnings. No one wanted to be healed. The silence of the escape was a mercy, not a crime. And here's the most heartbreaking part. I don't think they believed they were escaping destruction. I think they believed they were escaping transformation. That whatever was being born in the psychic depths of the Eldar race wasn't just going to kill them. It was going to change them, corrupt their souls, twist their memories, defile even the concept of who they had once been. And maybe the ones who boarded the Pale ships thought they could outrun that. Not the death, but the erasure. They weren't brave, they weren't pure, but they remembered. And sometimes, memory is the last kind of rebellion left. What the passengers of the Pale ship saw once they left, well, no one really knows for sure. And maybe that's the point. They weren't following star charts or pre-laid routes. These ships weren't fleeing from a location. They were fleeing from a fate. From a scream building deep in the psychic marrow of their species, a scream that hadn't yet found a voice but was already echoing through every Farseer's soul. And so, they vanished into the webway, or beyond it, or through it. Depends on who you ask. Some believe the Pale ships didn't just drift into the dark. They slipped into other dimensions, thin places between real space and the immaterium. There are a few preserved soul runes from Yimlock that mention the silence between veils, and some fans think that's a reference to the Pale ship's journey. Like they were aiming for sanctuaries that didn't even fully exist yet, trying to find places where the birth of She Who Thirsts wouldn't reach. Not because they thought they could escape forever, but because they needed time. Time to breathe, time to grieve, time to carry a fragment of their people into a future not yet poisoned. I've always been haunted by the idea that some of those aboard didn't think they would survive at all. That they boarded those ships knowing full well they were going to die, but still did it because they refused to be present when the soul of their civilization was torn apart. It wasn't a hope. It was a refusal, a final act of negation, like turning your back on a burning temple, not to save yourself, but to deny the flames your tears. And what did they see? There are fragments, just fragments. echoes in ancient prophecy. The Harlequins have dances that some say are based on the memories of pale ship survivors, routines filled with silence, sudden vanishing steps, and gestures of shielding the face. Some craft worlds record ghost signals, strange pulses in the webway that seem to echo back memories that aren't theirs. And there's a haunting belief among some bone singers that the oldest wraithbone structures hum with sorrow, not from any battle, but from the cries of those who glimpsed what was coming and fled too late. One controversial legend claims that one of the ships re-entered the webway for a moment just days before the fall, if you can measure time in such a way there, and released a single individual. Just one. No name, no rank, just a survivor whose mind was fractured beyond repair and whose psychic aura shimmered with images no other Eldar could look at without weeping. That story, if it's real, says more than 1,000 historical texts ever could. Because if even one pale ship returned, however briefly, then something about their escape wasn't just desperate, it was prophetic. What did they see? Maybe visions. Maybe fragments of she who thirsts long before she truly formed. Maybe psychic eddies of everything the Eldar had tried to ignore, the pain, the shame, the orgiastic brutality their society had become. Maybe they saw themselves, stripped of all the glamour and arrogance and golden masks. Maybe the void didn't show them stars, it showed them truth. And that, more than anything, might explain why so many of the pale ships were never heard from again. Not because they were lost, but because they couldn't bear to come back. Still, there's another side to this that I find just as compelling. Maybe they did survive. Maybe some of those ships found safe havens far beyond our reach. Small oases of peace where Eldar memory could root itself like seed in soil. Some fans even believe that certain outcast enclaves or deep webway nomads trace their lineage back to pale ship passengers. There are stories of Eldar who sing in languages no craft world recognizes, who wear symbols older than any known path, who dream in colors that warp spirit stones when spoken aloud. These might just be myths, or they might be what's left of a decision made in silence by people who chose mourning over madness. And that's the heartbreaking beauty of the pale ships. Not that they succeeded, not that they saved anyone, but that they tried. They took memory and wrapped it in silence and threw it into the void. Not to escape, but to remember. Not to live, but to not become. In a galaxy defined by war and noise and death, that's the quietest kind of resistance, and maybe the most powerful. They say that before a god dies, the universe weeps in colors no mortal eye can see. And for those aboard the pale ships, the weeping began long before the galaxy even realized it had anything left to mourn. Because these weren't just refugees from a dying civilization, they were witnesses to something far more profound. Not the collapse of cities or the end of songs, but the unmaking of divinity itself. They saw the death of gods. And that's not just metaphor. That's not poetic exaggeration. The Eldar pantheon, Kane, Isha, Val, and the others, weren't myths. They were real. And when the fall drew near, they suffered. There's a strange stillness described in some ancient psychic fragments linked to survivors, an unbearable silence, as if the warp had drawn a breath so deep that it made time itself hesitate. That moment, many believe, was the agony of Kane. The war god, the bloody-handed one, began to fracture. Not in the physical sense. Kane's form had never been made of matter, but his essence began to splinter across the warp. It's said that some aboard the pale ships felt the shards form inside their own souls. Like red fire cracking open their minds, they screamed in silence as echoes of his battle against the emerging Slanesh rattled through the void. Kane, once the defender, now nothing but a blade snapping under the weight of the inevitable. Some recorded visions, hazy, incomplete, scattered through soul-bound archives, describe an impossible duel. Kane facing something without form, something all hunger and silk and laughter. And every blow he struck only made it stronger. One pale ship seer, known only as the Veiled One, reportedly scrawled a prophecy across the interior of her cabin using her own blood. The god of war bled on the altar of pleasure, and the altar drank deep. That's not poetry. That's trauma made into scripture. Then there's Isha, the goddess of life, healing, and compassion. Her pain was quieter, but no less devastating. While Kani raged, she wept. Those aboard the ships often reported dreams of rain falling upward, of gardens blooming into ash, of lullabies sung by dying voices. Isha wasn't destroyed in the same way as Cain. According to scattered lore, she was taken, stolen by Nurgle, locked away in his garden, her voice reduced to a whisper that no longer reached her children. But the pale ship Seers felt it long before any mortal could name her fate. A sudden stillness in the empathic fields, an aching void where once there had been warmth. The comfort of Isha's presence, the mother spirit of the Eldar, was gone, and with it, the last sense of safety. It's hard to explain what it means when a race can feel their gods suffer. The Eldar didn't worship from a distance. Their divinities were extensions of their psyche, their soul architecture, reflections of what they were and what they could become. So when their gods began to die, it wasn't just spiritual, it was anatomical, as if part of their own essence was being skinned, inverted, rewritten. The pale ships became vessels of mourning as much as of escape, floating tombs that carried not only survivors, but echoes of divine extinction. Vol, the crippled smith, is the one I always return to, the god of craft, of patient labor, of sacrifice in silence. His death, or dissolution, or consumption, however you frame it, was perhaps the most tragic, because he didn't fight and he didn't flee. He endured. The seers who felt his fading often described it as a dull ache behind the eyes, a sense of unfinished work, a forge that never cooled but produced only dust. One tale, shared through an anonymous source aboard a now-lost pale ship, spoke of a dream in which Vol looked up from his anvil and saw that every tool he had forged had turned into a mirror. And in every mirror, he saw his children tearing themselves apart. Some say the ships themselves resonated with these agonies, that their walls pulsed with Kani's fury, that the lights flickered with Isha's grief, that their engines groaned with Vol's silence. A living requiem. Others believe the ships became sanctuaries precisely because they were out of phase with the psychic lattice that linked the gods to their people. That distance, that disconnection, became protection, a thin, bitter shield between them and the tidal wave of death surging through the immaterium. And yet, not all aboard were grateful for the insulation. Some couldn't bear the absence. There are records, unclear, perhaps exaggerated, of passengers carving effigies into the ship walls, singing prayers into the void, trying desperately to reach what was no longer listening. One seer reportedly ended his life by disintegrating his own soul, claiming he would rather dissolve into the warp and try to find Isha's whisper than remain adrift in a godless silence. It's easy to judge from the outside, but can you imagine what it must feel like to watch your own gods die in real time? That's the horror the pale ships carried. Not just survivors, not just witnesses, but remembrancers of divine death, of a mythology collapsing under the weight of its children's sins. And in that void, something new was being born. Something vast, cruel, beautiful, and eternally hungry. The passengers didn't just mourn what was, they feared what would take its place. Because if the gods die and the hunger lives, what does that say about the future of a race built on emotion, on art, on soul? In the end, maybe that's why no one really speaks of the pale ships, not just because they vanished, but because they remembered. And the truth they carried is too terrible to name. The ones who stayed behind weren't fools. It's a dangerous lie to believe that only the ignorant dance through the fires of the fall. Some knew, some saw, some screamed until their voices became ash and still no one listened. Among them were the seers, the oracles, the dreamwalkers, the weavers of possibility. These were not mystics draped in superstition. These were minds that lived across time, navigating cause and consequence with terrifying precision. And when the strands of fate began to blacken, they understood what was coming. All too well. But seeing the end and stopping it are two very different things. I've always been struck by the way Craftworld Eldar speak of those last days before the fall. There's no denial, no sugarcoating. They admit their arrogance, their blindness. But what hits hardest is the tone of grief when they talk about the far seers who remained. There's a reverence there, like one might have for a parent who died trying to shield their child from a flood. Because those seers, they didn't abandon their people. They tried to hold the tide back with bare hands. Many of them didn't even belong to the cults of excess. They lived apart, on the outskirts of civilization, often mocked as relics of an older age. Some were accused of fear-mongering, others of envy or worse, heresy. When they warned that something vast and terrible was forming in the warp, they were dismissed as overly dramatic or jealous of the new philosophies taking root in the core worlds. A few were even silenced outright, not with violence, though in some cases yes, but with ridicule, with exile, with the slow erosion of their voices from the chorus of Eldar thought. But still they tried. There are records, shattered and fragmented, that speak of attempts to redirect the psychic energy of entire cities, to calm the tides of emotion feeding the immaterium. Some seers formed circles, rituals of nullification that involved self-sacrifice, severing emotional threads from the collective soul to slow the storm. Imagine that. Imagine cutting pieces of your own spirit free, just to dim the psychic resonance of your people's orgies and cruelty. It didn't work, of course, but they tried over and over again, bleeding themselves dry in the name of a future that would not listen. Others turned to prophecy, not just reading the future, but throwing themselves into it. There's a tale I can't forget of a Farseer who locked herself in a chamber for 12 days, refusing food, water, even sleep. She submerged herself entirely in the skeins of fate, trying to find any thread that ended in survival. When they finally broke down the door, they found her dead, smiling but empty. And on the walls, painted in her own blood, were the words, "We do not survive, but some remember." That is enough. Even those on the craft worlds who had already begun to separate themselves from the core empire suffered. Farseers there reported collective nightmares so intense they caused seizures. Some burned out their own third eyes in desperate attempts to shut off the visions. Others walked into the webway and never came back, seeking answers that were likely worse than the questions. The soul stones from that era pulse differently, according to the bone singers. They carry a heavier vibration, like grief carved into crystal. And then came the tears. Not metaphorical ones, not poetic imagery. I mean real tears, flowing from the eyes of seers who had long since transcended such human responses. Because what they saw wasn't just destruction. It wasn't fire and collapse and screaming. It was loss. A loss so deep it cracked the idea of identity. They saw a future where every Eldar soul would become prey, where the afterlife itself would be devoured, where even memory would rot under the gaze of a god born from their own decadence. Some Farseers begged the gods, not as worshippers, but as children, pleading, bargaining, sacrificing themselves in sacred sites, hoping to awaken intervention. But the gods, as we know, were already dying. Or perhaps they were just watching, silent, helpless, knowing what was coming, but unable to break the laws of fate that the Elder themselves had written in blood and sensation. Cain's fury, Isha's silence, Vol's despair, all of it reflected back in the seer's visions like a mirror turned to the soul, and they broke under it. There's one myth I can't shake. It speaks of a group of Farseers who gathered just days before the psychic detonation that birthed Slaanesh. They formed a circle not to save themselves, but to anchor a single idea in the warp: remembrance. Not resistance, not hope, just the memory of what the Eldar had once been, preserved in a thought so sharp it would cut through the roar of the newborn god. The ritual killed them. All of them. But some believe that idea still floats, somewhere deep in the immaterium, like a spark waiting for breath. The tragedy is that many of these far seers didn't die in battle. They died in silence, forgotten, their warnings buried under laughter and flesh and golden madness. They weren't heroes. They weren't martyrs. They were simply those who knew, and that knowledge in the end became their undoing. Because when you truly see the fall, you can't unsee it. And when no one believes you, the loneliness is absolute. So yes, there were tears, but not just for the Eldar, for the gods, for the futures that would never be, for the songs that would never be sung, and for the silence they knew was coming, louder than any scream. Today, if you ask most Eldar about the pale ships, you'll get silence. Not the silence of ignorance, but of discomfort. Like the subject is a wound that never healed properly, or a story too tangled with grief to tell straight. There's no official record in the Craftworld archives, no name inscribed in memory stones, no commemorative rites in the path of the seer. And yet, the idea of the pale ships persists, quietly, in whispers, in dreams, in things not said. Some will tell you they were never real, just a fable woven after the fall, a myth to help the survivors cope, a way to pretend that someone had seen it coming and escaped the consequences. But I've always found that denial suspicious, too specific in what it omits. Why would a people with such an obsessive culture of memory, whose very survival depends on recording and preserving souls, forget something like this? The answer, I think, is that they didn't forget. They buried it. You still see echoes in unexpected places. In the Harlequins' dances, particularly the ones rarely performed except on shadowed craft worlds like Lugganath or Ilkaithe, there are sequences called the Fade into the Veil. These movements are unlike anything else, slow, deliberate, mournful, full of gestures that mimic shielding the eyes or pointing to nowhere. Some say it's a dramatization of the ship's departure, others think it's symbolic of the gods turning their backs. But a few scholars, mostly outcasts, believe it's a psychic reenactment of the exact moment when the pale ships severed themselves from Eldar fate lines. Not to change the future, but to step out of it entirely. Bonesingers occasionally speak of ships that hum differently, old vessels with no clear origin, whose wraithbone structures resonate in minor tones not found in standard craftworld construction. They describe a quiet ache, a melodic mourning embedded in the hull itself. Some of these ships are avoided, others are kept sealed. A few, more curious or daring, have tried to communicate with them, claiming they respond only to dreams or to the psychic presence of those who have lost everything. A few even think the pale ships still exist, hidden deep within the webway, sailing blind through forgotten paths, crewed by Eldar who no longer age, no longer speak, but only remember. Among the Exodites, there are legends passed down that feel like echoes of the pale ship exodus. Stories of sky beasts made of starlight, of ancestors who left before the gods screamed, of long voyages into nothingness led by weeping seers. These tales are often dismissed by craftworld academics as symbolic origin myths, but the details, too consistent, too weird, feel like something older, something half-remembered and refracted through exile and time. Even the Drukhari, who pride themselves on rejecting the sentimentality of the craft worlds, have fragments. In the depths of Kamara's torture halls, carved into bone murals and flayed skin paintings, are recurring images of blank ships and veiled figures stepping into the dark. There's one particularly disturbing mosaic in a lost corner of the Dark Mimes district, a sequence showing Eldar being consumed by golden light while a handful walk away into shadow, their faces unreadable. Most who view it feel sick afterward. Some call it art, others call it warning. And in the rarest places, in the minds of the oldest surviving seers, there are dreams. Dreams of white corridors that pulse like veins, of voices speaking in reverse time, of doorways that lead to places that are not places. These visions aren't shared publicly. Often they're dismissed as the madness of old age or the result of proximity to the warp. But a few believe they're bleed-throughs, psychic residue from those who left. A last tether still stretching across the stars. Why does it matter what's remembered and what's not? Because for the Eldar, memory is survival. Every soul that's trapped in a spirit stone, every ritual along the path, every movement in a harlequin's dance, it's all about resisting the pull of she who thirsts, about holding on to identity, to meaning, to self. And the pale ships, they represent a kind of memory the Eldar don't know what to do with. One filled not with triumph, but with retreat, not with glory, but with grief. And that kind of memory is dangerous. It can unravel you if you let it in. But here's the thing. I think they should be remembered. Not because they succeeded, or because they were noble, or even because they left, but because they chose. They acted. In a moment when the rest of the Eldar were either lost in ecstasy or paralyzed by disbelief, the ones aboard those ships moved. That matters. That echoes. So yes, the pale ships may be mythologized, spun into half-truths and buried under ritual, but they're still there, in the stories that don't quite fit, in the dreams that taste like ash, in the silence that sometimes follows the songs of the soul bards. They're still sailing, somewhere, not toward salvation, but away from the scream. And maybe that's the only direction that ever really mattered. The galaxy doesn't pause to mourn, not for a dying star, not for a fallen civilization, and certainly not for a forgotten ship gliding silently through the webway. Time in Warhammer moves like a chainsword, fast, loud, and without mercy. But for the Elder, memory is survival. In a universe that eats souls, twists truth, and burns history just for the thrill, remembering becomes an act of resistance. And that's why the story of the Pale Ship still matters. Not because it offers hope. Hope is rare and fragile, but because it forces us to ask, what does it mean to turn away from extinction, even if you can't stop it? A lot of Eldar, especially the younger ones born into craft world paths, don't want to hear about the Pale Ships. I've met some who say it's just a tragic footnote, a failed detour, survivors who ran and vanished and did nothing to change the course of history. But to me, that's exactly the point. They didn't change the future. They didn't defeat Slanesh. They didn't prevent the fall. And still, they chose. They acted when almost no one else did. They turned mourning into motion. In a culture paralyzed by indulgence, that is revolutionary. Because today, even now, even after all these millennia of pain, the Eldar are still facing extinction. The fall wasn't a single moment. It was the first domino. The psychic wound is still open. The thirst is still gnawing. Every soul still risks being consumed unless locked in a stone, unless protected by ritual and structure and sheer willpower. The Pale Ships didn't stop the fall, but they offered a philosophy, a response to the unimaginable. One that didn't rely on weapons or vengeance or gods. Just distance. Just leaving. And there's power in that idea even now. What does it mean to survive without victory? To walk away instead of fighting a war you already know is lost? That question matters more now than ever. Not just for the Eldar, but for every fading race in the galaxy. The Imperium clings to ruin like its doctrine. The Tau overreach with every breath. The Necrons dream of restoring order through death. But the Eldar, they remember. They carry every death, every failure, every lost god in their bones. And because of that, they also carry the potential for something else. Not redemption, maybe, but reflection. The Pale Ships are a reflection, a mirror showing what it looks like to act without winning, to grieve without surrendering. In many ways, they were a prototype for what would later become the craft worlds themselves. The idea of escaping the core rot of the Empire, of building a path-based society that structured emotion and memory, that began with those early exiles. The Pale Ships were the seed of diaspora, even if the craft worlds never speak of them directly. Without those ships, without that first scattering, would the craft worlds have even tried to leave? Or would they have sunk with the rest? There's also a deeper, quieter relevance, especially among seers and spirit guides. Many believe that the Pale Ships seeded a thought form in the warp itself, a kind of psychic echo that hasn't faded, a resonance of mourning in motion. It's not power in the traditional sense, it's not a weapon, but it's a presence. Some farseers claim that when they look into the skein of future possibility, they occasionally see shapes, long, white vessels drifting at the edge of probability. Not in real space, not in any charted webway path, just out there, watching, waiting, and somehow still remembering. And that's what keeps me thinking about them. Not the aesthetics, not the mystery, but the function. The idea that memory, once given shape, can survive the death of everything around it. The Eldar are a dying people, yes, but they are not yet dead. And in the Pale Ships, we see a message carved into the bones of reality, that memory is not weakness, that exile can be a kind of strength, that even when everything collapses, there are still ways to carry the truth forward. Some fans think the Pale Ships will return one day, not as saviors, but as witnesses, that when the final scream echoes across the stars, whether from the collapse of the Imperium, the rise of some new horror, or the awakening of the last old one, those ships will be there, watching, maybe recording, maybe delivering the final eulogy. I don't know if I believe that, but the idea of it sticks with me. That somewhere, someone who remembers what we were still survives. So yes, millions died, gods fell, civilizations burned, and maybe nothing can ever undo that. But the Pale Ships, they carried the grief forward, not to forget, but to ensure it's felt. Because if the Eldar forget what they were, if they forget the silence that came before the scream, then Slaanesh wins all over again. And that, more than any sword or spell or battle, is what must never be allowed. Not because it will save the galaxy, but because it might just save the soul. What makes the story of the Pale Ships so haunting isn't that they failed or succeeded. It's that they left, that they vanished into silence, not as conquerors, not as victims, but as something harder to define. Witnesses who refused to watch the fire from within the blaze. They didn't scream, they didn't fight, they didn't try to be heroes. They simply turned away when everyone else danced toward the edge. And somehow, that act of walking into the void carries more weight than any battlefield legend ever could. Because this wasn't victory. There was no triumph. The fall still happened. Slaanesh still tore through the Eldar soul like a cosmic parasite, screaming into existence on a wave of ecstasy and ruin. The gods died. The Empire shattered. And the galaxy changed forever. The Pale Ships didn't stop it. They weren't trying to. They were trying to not become part of it. And that choice, to flee into the unknown not out of fear, but out of refusal, is its own kind of tragedy. A quiet defiance. A protest written in motion instead of words. There's something unbearably human in that, even if the Eldar are anything but human. We all understand the desire to run from what we can't fix. We all know what it feels like to scream into a crowd and be ignored. The Pale Ships are more than myth, because they reflect a truth so raw it burns. Sometimes the only way to keep something alive is to walk away with it, even if it means leaving everything else behind. And what did they carry with them? Not power, not hope, not even safety. They carried memory, the raw, painful memory of a civilization that could have been eternal, but instead chose to lose itself. They remembered the whispers before the scream, the dreams before the madness, the gods before the hunger. They carried songs that no longer had listeners, names that had already been erased, griefs that hadn't yet been mourned. That was the cargo. That was the burden. and no one else would take it. The image that always gets me, always, comes from an obscure poem found etched into the walls of a derelict waygate on Bel Shemoth, one of those dead webway worlds left to drift. It says, "They left us not to escape, but so someone would still know how to grieve." That line breaks me, because in a universe where death is common and memory is fragile, grief itself becomes a sacred act. The pale ships didn't preserve the Eldar. They preserved their sorrow, their truth. And maybe that's the most sacred thing that remains. There's no grand reveal at the end of this. No secret pale ship hidden in the core of a craft world. No hidden dynasty waiting to return. The tragedy is quieter than that. It's in the absence, in the hollow places of the webway, in the strange hum of old spirit stones, in the faint flicker of an emotion that doesn't quite have a name anymore. And in that silence, there's a choice. Do we forget or do we remember? I think we should remember, not to dwell, not to romanticize exile or loss, but because the pale ships remind us that sometimes survival isn't about victory. It's about carrying the weight when no one else will, about preserving what matters not in vaults or rituals, but in refusal. Refusal to let it be erased, refusal to let it become nothing. So maybe they're still out there. Maybe not the ships themselves, but the idea of them, the legacy. Somewhere, beyond the edge of what we call known, drifting through currents we no longer understand, there may still be a vessel humming with sorrow, keeping a story alive. Not because it must, but because someone once decided it could. And if that story moved something in you, if the quiet grief of the pale ships echoes even a little in your mind, then remember it. Keep it alive. Let it travel with you. Because that's how myths live. Not through monuments, but through the people who whisper them when no one else will. And hey, if you've made it this far with me, across all these memories and shadows and silent ships, maybe you're the kind of person who understands why we tell stories like this. So if you want more journeys like this, more forgotten paths, more heavy truths, more ghosts wrapped in starlight, subscribe. Stay with me. Because the galaxy is full of stories like the pale ships, stories we've buried, stories worth remembering.